Included. Welcome, and I hope you're all having a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Tipping Point, Connecticut's first affordable housing conference series. My name is Charlie Shaddix. I'm the communications manager at the Partnership for Strong Communities. Throughout the week, we're hosting over 30 sessions featuring local, state, and national experts leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. I know it's hard to believe, but this is the last session of this year's Tipping Point. This conference has been a whirlwind of data, advocacy, research, solutions, and energy from across the Connecticut housing world. I want to thank each and every one of you, each and every one of the presenters, keynote speakers, and attendees for making this conference a success. And I also want to thank the partnership staff for their dedicated work on Tipping Point, including our policy director, Sean Guillot, our senior policy analyst, Kaylee Pratt, our executive director, Kylie Gosselin, and our deputy director, Chelsea Ross, who put in so much work in organizing this conference. She is the conductor of this symphony. Now, what better way to end this conference than to take us back to the start? On Monday, you heard from Dr. Tiffany Manuel, a leader in messaging and framing the challenges and opportunities that exist around housing nationwide. Today, you're going to hear more about some research and focus grouping that Dr. Manuel did in Fairfield County. We're going to be showing you a pre-recorded presentation where Dr. Manuel talks about her work leading focus groups in Fairfield County in order to collect data on what Fairfielders consider the most and least effective housing narratives. And this research, this focus grouping, and Dr. Manuel's work has already informed a lot of the work that we do around how we message housing in Connecticut, and will continue to do so. After Dr. Manuel's presentation, there's a pre-recorded Q&A with Mendi Blue-Paca, the Chief Impact Officer at Fairfield County's Community Foundation. So just want to let you know that this session is going to go for an hour and 30 minutes, but if you have questions, then they may be answered in that Q&A. Before I start this video, we'd like to thank our leading sponsors for this conference, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Melville Charitable Trust. Their support is absolutely integral for the existence of this conference. I also want to thank our collaborating sponsor, the Connecticut Department of Housing, and our supporting sponsors, Housing Enterprises Incorporated and Whittlesey. Finally, we would like to thank our session sponsor for this session, Fairfield County's Community Foundation. A couple of housekeeping notes before we start. This is a webinar style format, so just stop sharing for a second. This is a webinar style format, so you will be able to chat, but as I mentioned, this is pre-recorded, so we can't answer your questions live, or I guess we can, but Dr. Manuel cannot. And finally, there's going to be a couple of surveys sent out at the end of this session. There's going to be a session survey on what you thought on the session, and there's also going to be an overall survey that we're doing for the strategic planning for our Home Connecticut campaign that kind of asks you about how we can best serve the challenges and needs of affordable housing in Connecticut. So with all that being said, I am going to start the actual video of the presentation, and bear with me just a second as we get screen sharing up, but after that we should be all good. And so just enjoy the presentation by Dr. Manuel. Also, just before I start, if you can't hear the audio on this, we already tested this out, but if you can't hear the audio on this, then just let me know in the chat and we can get it started.
This is the third and final webinar in our series on housing equity and opportunity in Fairfield County. Just as a reminder for those who have been with us throughout the series, in part one, A Tale of Two Cities, we considered how racially discriminatory housing policy in our region led to current housing inequities. In part two, why housing inequity is everyone's issue, we explored the impact of extreme housing inequity in Fairfield County and how that inequity directly affects health, well-being, and economic development at both household and population levels. And today, we're in for a real treat. We'll discuss the way forward, a new narrative for housing in Fairfield County. You'll hear an overview of an in-depth field research into the challenges of building public support for affordable housing in Fairfield County. Our speaker, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, will present a playbook designed to help the public and political will increase in order to address our region's affordable housing crisis. So now for a little more background on this research project. The Fairfield County Housing Alliance partners identified a lack of public will as a critical barrier in accessing and increasing affordable housing in the county. Through a generous grant from Melville Charitable Trust, the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity was able to engage the nationally renowned sociologist, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, and her research team to conduct a community voice session, or multiple sessions that is, with over 200 Fairfield County residents to determine what narrative roadblocks exist to creating more public support for affordable housing, and to use that data to craft a new narrative around this issue that will effectively change hearts and minds. A bit more about Dr. Manuel. Dr. Tiffany Manuel, or Dr. T, as she prefers to be called, is a dynamic speaker, best-selling author, and the president and CEO of TheCase Made, an organization dedicated to helping leaders powerfully and intentionally make the case for systems change. In her role at TheCase Made, Dr. T works with hundreds of passionate social change makers, innovators, and adaptive leaders around the United States who are building better, stronger communities that are diverse, equitable, and inclusive. By aligning their community stakeholders around the kind of deep systems change that can improve population outcomes, these leaders are able to grow their impact, scale their programs, and harness the investments they need to improve communities. She's literally written the book on public will building, strategic case making, the field for building public and political will. And you'll soon find out why Dr. T is considered the nation's foremost expert on this topic. We'll also share a link later with information on how you can purchase, or we've shared a link now with information on how you can purchase Dr. T's book if you're interested in learning more about this process of public will building. And before I turn the program over to Dr. T, I'd like to take a few seconds to go over a couple housekeeping items regarding how the webinar will work today. So please note that the session is being recorded and will be available on the center's website shortly after we end. All audience members have been placed on mute, but we do encourage everyone to submit questions in the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. And there will be a question and answer session at the end of the panel with Dr. T and myself. And feel free, as your fellow webinar participants submit questions in the Q&A section, feel free to upvote the questions that you want to have asked. If you don't have a question but would simply like to leave a comment, please use the chat function for those purposes. And as a reminder, both the Q&A and chat are public and they're visible to the audience and recorded, so you can just keep that in mind as you post. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn the program over to you, Dr. T.
Thank you so much, Mendi, for that introduction. So I'm excited to share the findings of research that we've been conducting over the last couple of months in partnership with a number of organizations across the region, but really led by a fantastic a group of local folks there at the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. They put together early on a steering committee of folks to kind of help shepherd this process through its various phases. And I just want to say, just first before I start, just thank you to all of those partners, because it was helpful to have that kind of thoughtful iteration as we're going through the findings and going through the actual process of what it means to think about narrative and how we use it and leverage it for the benefit of folks who are living in Fairfield County. So I'm going to start the presentation with a little bit of an introduction to why this is important, and just I'm assuming that because most people are here that you have a little bit of an understanding of kind of what we're trying to do, but I want to put some of this in broader context. And then the majority of the time today, I really want to use for us to drill down in some of the recommendations and then maybe talk through one of the examples. So I'm going to start my screen here. I'll share my screen here. All right. So let's start from kind of what it is we're talking about and what is we're trying to do. I'll say, just as an introduction to the work that I do across the country, is I work a lot with organizations who are trying to build public and political will around issues that require a lot of collaboration and coordination. And I would say we do a lot in the housing space across the country, not only because I have deep expertise in housing policy and data and analysis and strategy, but also because housing is one of those issues where, as a nation, we've sort of kicked that can down the road quite a few times. And so what's happened is a crisis, almost in every community, a major kind of housing market across the country, but not a lot of sort of public support for this, a growing sense of political support, but an unevenness across the country. And so I'm often called to work with Metropolitan Council of Governments, often called to work with state, local governments who are trying to figure out how to land innovative housing solutions and how to get and mobilize some activity around that. And I will tell you that it's tough. In some places we work, there's a lot of public will. There's a sense that affordable housing or housing in general is something we should be thinking about and working on. But there may not be much political will. Policymakers may not be really sort of leaning into that as an animating issue of concern. In some places we work, the opposite is true. You've got a lot of political will. Policymakers are leaning in, but they're having trouble getting the public to support the things that they want to do. Things like rezoning, things like even issues around NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard tends to come up. When policymakers put resources on the table to build affordable housing, but then you have communities that fight it, right? It's this conversation of, we now have political will, but we don't have sort of broader public will to advance the things that really matter. And then in some places we have kind of both of those things that are non-existent. There's not a lot of interest from the public space. There's not a lot of interest from political policymakers, but there's a small group of folks who are, what I would say, adaptive leaders who are trying to sort of sound the alarm, like, hey folks, there's a real problem here. And if we don't figure out how to get people to recognize it as such, and not only to recognize the challenge, but also then to get mobilized and excited about the possibility of working together to solve those things, that if we don't get people mobilized now, we're going to fail at the effort. And so a lot of the work that we do is, how do you get people to mobilize around stuff that's hard, especially in housing space where there is some shared sacrifice that has to happen if we are going to be able to land some of these really innovative housing solutions. And especially at a time when there's so much in crisis around us in other spaces, right? You watch the news any night of the week, and it's just a series of just crises. Right? And so how do you help position people for success in the conversation around housing when the environment that we're in is so disruptive and is so crisis driven that it becomes hard to get people to want to lean into these kind of conversations? So I've been proselytizing about this issue of public will building for some time, and I think now we've sort of reached a fever pitch in a number of different places, especially housing in particular, where we have to invest time and resources in how we engage people thoughtfully around these issues. And so I not only speak about these issues across the country, but I write extensively about them. So a lot of resources on my website. Some of you know some of the pieces that you see here, like You Don't Have to Live Here, which was one of the things that I did in 2016 for the Frameworks Institute, to really kind of sound the alarm. This narrative, pay attention, folks. This narrative stuff is really important. The way we're engaging folks is really important, and a lot of our messaging is backfiring in ways that are actually making it much more difficult for us to be able to advance solutions. So I'm going to start the actual presentation just giving a little bit more context and just say, I'm going to start where I hope most of you are, especially those folks who've been in housing for a while and you're in this space a lot. You know that we are probably in the fight of our lives, is what I would describe it. Like, this is the moment in the movie, right, where the heroine has to, he's down on the ground and the aliens are coming, and like, he's got this last this last pitch across, like of the, you know, whatever the zombie apocalypse is, if he doesn't like push the button at that moment to do something big and transformational and important, you know, the whole world kind of ends, I certainly don't want to seem apocalyptic in some way, shape, or form. But I think, you know, what we're witnessing right now in housing really is important. If we don't, and actually, let me step back from that, and I will say, it's not just in housing, in a number of areas. If you think about climate change, if you think about what's happening with our democracy, right? If you think about housing, if you think about our healthcare system, we've been kicking the can down the road on a lot of these issues, and they're now bubbling up as just crisis. We have to solve for them. And we have our own set of those things in the housing system. We are at the moment where we haven't seen this level of crisis in more than a generation. And so our ability to communicate that to folks without making them feel like it's so overwhelming that they can't change it is really, you know, there is an art and a science to this. And this project is about that art and that science. So I will say, you know, let's just acknowledge what the headwinds are up front. We know that we're in a political environment. It's a political season. It's just our communities have gotten much more partisan in terms of the conversation about lots of issues. Housing tends to be an issue that is bipartisan usually, and our need to make sure that it stays bipartisan is really tough but necessary. And so that's a headwind, man. We're facing, like, how do we keep this on the rails, like making sure that we're not getting into a food fight around things that are too important to devolve into this kind of unfortunate kind of back and forth. But what's happened in the state, in the sense that we are polarized and often suspicious around these issues, or on all kinds of issues, what's happening kind of in the culture. People are polarized. As you know, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Are you this or you that? And people are often suspicious as you get backfires on things that shouldn't be backfiring. So this is just an example. Shelter Force, I'm on the board of Shelter Force magazine, and just last week put out a really interesting piece just talking about, and just one example among many happening across the country, where it used to be sort of not in my backyard stuff was happening mostly in higher income communities that didn't want, quote unquote, those people or that kind of housing in their neighborhood because they had all kind of negative assumptions about it. But now we're seeing across the country, even low and moderate income neighborhoods saying no, right, to development, whether it's affordable or right, just no. And so this is a particularly interesting one in Camden, where, you know, a lot of the activists have been pushing kind of the political leaders for a long time to do some development outside of the waterfront. So the waterfront area is beautiful. They've been building up for a long time. And the neighborhoods have been saying, hey, listen, like, there's no place, like, you aren't developing our neighborhoods, you aren't investing in the power and capacity of the people in neighborhoods. And so, right, Camden policymakers have said, okay, now we're going to invest in neighborhoods. We heard you. And then when they have been trying to do that, residents have come out against it, saying, no, we don't want it. And so the policymakers are going, like, what the hell? Like, you've been, you know, protesting forever about development in this community. We finally are able and willing to invest in neighborhoods, and there's a sort of pushing against that. What's happening is that folks are polarized and suspicious, and you can see in the comment here, just one of many that you can certainly go to Shelter Force and read more. But one of the residents says, you know what, we recognize they're not building this for us, right? What does that mean? They're not building this for us. And the conception is, we know what happens when these developments come to our neighborhoods. Now what you're going to do is you're going to build a couple units of affordable housing. Most of them are going to be market rate. And the next thing you know, the Starbucks will be here, the Abercrombie and Finch will be here. And the next thing you know, we're being displaced because prices for housing are rising around these so-called, right, low and moderate income developments. So the reality is some of that might be true. I mean, we can have a real conversation, hopefully, on this call about the fact that, right, sometimes development does gentrify or displace folks, and we have to, there are a whole range of anti-displacement strategies we could certainly lead into. But the point that I want to make to you all is, if we are not careful in the current environment in which we're trying to do this work, because people are often polarized and suspicious, sometimes for very good reasons, right, but for a whole lot of reasons, it means that our great intentions, our good intentions, can backfire. And that's not what we want. Like, right, the whole purpose of doing this work is we're trying to help folks have a place to stay in the region, and that can sometimes backfire. And Camden is only one place across the country, but I'm seeing this, and shelter for us is sort of sounding the alarm. We're starting to see this in more areas, especially as the conversation about displacement and gentrification become wider and bigger concerns. The other sort of place where we're facing headwinds is just in the narrative, right? So in 2016, as I said before, I did this paper around "You Don't Have to Live Here," which was kind of sounding the alarm, saying, listen, folks, we're not paying attention to the way that our messages are backfiring, or we're just consistently, right, around the country. And here are some of the ways in which we can see it, right? When you talk about affordable housing, the narrative around, for example, personal responsibility and mobility is huge. People will say, well, I get it. It's expensive in Fairfield, but hey, listen, maybe you got to move someplace else. Maybe Fairfield is not the place for you. Right? You got to move to Camden, right? Or maybe South Carolina. They got great, more affordable homes for somebody at your, who's looking at your paycheck. That's not a terribly helpful response, but you can't talk people out of that stuff. And so what we were trying to say with this paper is, listen, folks, we have to get more attentive to the ways that our public narratives, although they are well-intentioned, can backfire. So it's not my intention today on this call to talk through that. You can certainly download that for the website. What I want to say is that there's a better opportunity to do what Desmond Tutu called sort of making a better argument, right? Desmond Tutu, some of you may remember, South African social rights activist who was speaking around the end of apartheid in South Africa, one of the most, violent and repressive probably regimes in the history of the world, probably. Coming out of that incredibly violent experience, and listen, we can yell at each other and fight about this, but it really doesn't help anything when we do that, right? We have to learn to improve the argument, to improve the way that we engage folks and pull them forward, right, into a deeper conversation about the morality of what's happening to our people. And so what I'm inviting you all to do and to think about is certainly the things that I write about, think about, talk to folks about every day, is how do we invite people into a different conversation that's not backfiring into, dominant narratives that are just not helpful and not constructive. And how do we do that at a moment when our communities around a whole lot of issues are polarized and suspicious? How do we navigate that environment? So what I would say to you is, one of the, I am trained in all kinds of methodologies and econometrics and, all kinds of, got my degree in ways of, manipulate data in all kinds of ways, or at least shape data in all kinds of ways. And what I can say to you is probably the best thing we can ever do on issues like this is to talk to people. I get at more than anything first, before you get to all the sort of data manipulations and impact assessments and all that, is to talk to folks, to say, hey, right, what's happening in the way that you think about these issues? And so first things first, as part of this project, we listened, right? We got lots of folks across the region, average everyday folks. We hired a professional recruiting firm to recruit diverse groups of folks from all over the Fairfield County specifically, and had them talk to each other about some of these issues. So the results of what you see are some of the narrative conversations that we had, the insights that came out of your neighbors and residents and small business owners and, all kinds of folks across the region that offer up a glimpse so that we understand how the folks that we're talking to understand these issues, and also where some of our messaging can go off the rails if we're not responding to the way that people are thinking about these issues. So let me just say, when we are conducting these, what we call community voice sessions is what we call them, we're listening to the voices of actual residents, hearing the way they think about issues. We're not listening for whether or not they support this particular affordable housing policy, or do they support accessory dwellings? Are they interested in more bonds? Are they interested? But we're not. That's not the primary central concern. We're listening for, as they talk about this issue among themselves, are the core things that we need to make a strong case for affordable housing present in the way that they think about these issues? So for this person on the left, when we're listening for, is there a strong sense of we as the people, citizens, residents of Fairfield, and is there a strong sense of why people think this is an important issue or should be engaged in this issue or not? Because if there's not, it's hard to build a stronger narrative. It's hard to build a strong narrative on top of that if there's not really a strong sense of we and why this is important. Are there some really ugly kind of dominant narratives that are keeping people from embracing some of the policies, we would say? And what are those narratives? What are the people's stereotypes or things that they, the conceptions they bring to the table that are just not terribly helpful? We want to understand what those are. And I would also say we want to understand what some of the what we call negative disruptors. So when people do start to have a pretty decent conversation, they're getting kind of going around affordable housing, what are the things that tend to disrupt that conversation, right? And take it in the opposite direction. So, people will start talking about, well, I think affordable housing is kind of a good thing because we can get more people in the community and, we can have diversity of folks at all levels of income. And then somebody will say, well, that may be true, but you remember last year we tried to do whatever it is. And then, right, that's the thing that pushes, they all go, yeah, that is true. Yeah, I guess we can't get progress there. We're listening for those kinds of negative disruptors, not so that we can just write them down, but so we can give you some strategies for how to navigate around them and get in front of it. So before that has a chance to land in the conversation or in your messaging, how to get and then navigate out of it. So I won't go through all of this, but I just want to share that this is our framework for strategic case making. In the book that was sort of mentioned at the top, we talk about these 10 principles. What's the social science behind each of these principles? Why they help you to make a stronger case? And our work with you all is to figure out how much of this do people have? Do they have a sense of us? Do they get a sense of why? Do they understand that this is about systems change and that equity is in it? Do they come in the room with equity or no? So what I want to share with you, just really at high level at this point, is just some of the major findings along the lines of some of these issues. So we've had some strong recommendations from the work that we did, the research, based on our listening for some of these issues. So let me just say, the first exercise that we often do, that we always do, especially for some of the initial groups, is we do an exercise, and people, when they come to our session, they don't know why they're coming to the session. They're just told that this is a virtual session where we're going to talk about community issues, things that are challenging or opportunities for our communities. And so they come just with that basic understanding. And the first exercise that we give them is we ask them to put down the 3 things they need policymakers to address. And we say something like, if you could get all the policymakers in the room, you could get everybody from your local kind of city council or your planning department, everybody from your mayor, or all those folks, if you could get your county execs or whoever that looks like, you could get all of your congressional leadership at the state level and the federal level, you can get the president or governor, you get them all in a room, and you give them 3 things that for you are most important to solve for. Like, you've got to nail these things. These are deeply important to me. Solve these 3 things. What would those 3 things be? And the reason we give that exercise is because we're trying to figure out the salience of this issue of affordable housing. Is that in their top animating concerns or not? Right? Is this something that they really think is important or not? And not only that, when they give us that, we have a little discussion afterward. And if they say housing, we want to understand kind of what's the strength of that, the intensity of their desire to have this conversation. So what I will say to you, just as a matter of course, as our initial part of our findings, as you might suspect, there weren't a whole lot of people who said housing. I mean, it was almost absent from people's consciousness. And I will say, I do this all over the country, so it varies. When I go to San Francisco, every single person who comes in the door names housing as their first or second concern. And usually the top 2, they will say affordable housing, and then they'll say homelessness are their top 2 out of 3 concerns, like solve that, right? They get it. In other parts of the country, it's a little bit, it kind of comes and goes. And then in some places, like Fairfield, I would say it's not even on the radar. People were like, healthcare. They said a lot about healthcare, a lot about education. Some folks talked about transportation. Because we did these right around the time when you had the George Floyd stuff happening and there was a lot of protests happening, some folks mentioned, justice, racial justice, and those kinds of issues. But housing was rarely, I would say, an animating concern. And when it wasn't a kind of passionate, hey, we ought to, right? It was more that somebody ought to do something for those people, right? Because something's going on, as opposed to this is something deeply personal for me and I have a stake in it. And I feel like, and that's important. When we do these sessions, we listen for that first person voice. Like, this is really important. We need to be, right there, I talked about the strong sense of we need to be, this is our, how much of that is there. And not only was housing missing, but it wasn't a whole lot of this is about us. It was more about this is about those folks, which is a challenge for us, right? So I just want to start us off by saying, right, just at the matter of the front door, it's not the thing that housing as a concern is not the thing that's animating people's initial conversation about what matters to them. And I would also say, as a second kind of finding of this conversation that we had with folks was, we talked to them about why it wasn't a bigger concern for them. I said, hey, y'all are in a part of the country where y'all are paying a whole lot of money for housing, and nobody seems to be concerned about that. Tell me what's happening here. Like, I'm confused, right? And sometimes I use the kind of inside-outside kind of conversations to get people to explain to me, right? To position them as experts. I say, hey, I don't even live in Fairfield. Talk to me. Tell me what's happening, right? I'm looking at what's happening. I see this is important, but y'all don't. So help me understand what I'm not seeing, or what I don't see that you all see. And there were several things that came up initially. We're going to talk about some of the deeper ones in the recommendations, but I want to just call out one of the primary things that came out of that was a lot of folks said, for those folks especially for whom they said, this is not even important to me. Not only is it not on my radar screen, but it doesn't have anything to do with me. Folks who said, listen, I've been living in Fairfield for a long time. I own my own home. This is just not an issue for me. I appreciate that. Folks who are just moving in in the county, they might be struggling to find a place. Folks who are trying to rent that, but for me, this is just not a big deal. It doesn't have anything to do with me. So for the folks for whom this is an issue, they need to figure that out. That has nothing to do with me. So they were not seeing their stake in it because they felt like that moment when they were trying to buy a home, or folks who would say, well, I found a place to rent that's really good. I have a great landlord. We have a great relationship. So that's not really an issue for me. So for those folks who felt like that affordable housing conversation had been solved, right, that was resolved, right? So they didn't feel a sense of connection in the way that we really would like them to, and to have the opportunity to do so. So just out of the gate, right, you got those issues to grapple with. So what I want to go through now is just some of the recommendations. We have an abbreviated time today to talk with each other, so I want to make sure that we're getting enough time to have questions and those kind of things as part of our conversation. So I'm going to go through just a few of these, and we'll talk through how folks get the full recommendations and when we're going to kind of share that with everybody. So there are 13 recommendations. I'll go through a few, especially the ones that are particularly overriding. One I would just say is really there's a real need to kind of leverage the power of this moment. Yeah, I know that lots of us are feeling like I was sharing at the very top of the conversation, like this is a ride or die moment for housing. This is the moment. We won't get a better shot at trying to transform housing systems so that they are more equitable and sustainable and inclusive than we have at this moment. But not everybody is feeling the power of this moment. And so, leverage the strong power of this moment, especially around a sense of we. I would say that Fairfield folks were talking about how they love Fairfield. There's not a sense of, reticence about, where they live. There's a strong sense of place. And often when I do these groups, I ask people to, tell me about times when people in Fairfield were able to overcome some really hard stuff. And in some places, they don't have a recollection. When I do that kind of thing in DC, they don't, But when I did it in Fairfield, they had a long list of things where they could remember when, we came together around this issue, we came together on that, and they had a long list of things they could come up with. So there are folks who can remember when we worked together, we came together around some big ticket items, and what I would say to you is leverage that, because people have an immediate sense of that. And there were a lot of sort of nodding heads, yeah, I remember that, oh yeah, I remember that. And I can certainly give them that. We'll put some of these examples in the final version of the playbook. But the idea that you've got that already can be significant. It's a place where you can actually build a broader appeal for support, kind of based on the strong sense of we that we found in Fairfield. And I would say I don't always find that in every place, so it's important to share that. I'd also say that, listen, folks, as I said, name the power of this moment. You and I understand the power of this moment, of getting other folks to embrace this moment, and the urgency of action is why you want to put that in front of folks. one of the things we did in the community voice sessions was that we talked about, listen, there's a whole lot of stuff going on, nationally. There's a whole lot of stuff going on locally. This is the moment to get involved. And if we don't take hold of what is the housing circumstances in Fairfield, we're going to lose the very things that we love about Fairfield. And so this is the moment to get involved. And when you put that forward, it's interesting. It pulls people forward, and they want to know, okay, so what do we do? So they didn't have a whole lot of ideas about what to do. We'll talk about that in a second. But it pulled them forward enough that they wanted to figure out, okay, I get it. I feel the urgency. Okay, what's next? How do we plan for it? So what I would say to you all is to build that sense of urgency about this issue without evoking crisis, right? We don't want to say this is a crisis and, oh my God, the sky is falling in. But hey, listen, folks, the power and possibility of this moment is significant. We have the power to change the shape and nature of our communities for the next generation. The moment, all the disruption, whether it's COVID-19 or the racial justice protest or what's happening in our healthcare sector, what's happening right into climate issues, is giving us the opportunity to lean in a way and to get people involved in the conversation in a way that we haven't been able to do in more than a generation. This is the moment. When people feel like there's some momentum and like their energies can actually add real value, right, and that can really be kind of effective in the space, we want to leverage that for our benefit. 3 was about, so here's a really important point. I really want y'all to pay attention to this one, because when we ask folks when we listen to folks talk about Fairfield and why housing wasn't kind of in their top kind of issue, a large part of the conversation was that the fact that a large part of the analysis from our point was they were viewing Fairfield from housing as a commodity standpoint. So when they talked about, housing in Fairfield and why it was so expensive, they started adding up literally adding up all the things they get in Fairfield. And they would say, well, Fairfield, we're close to New York. We've got a pretty good transit system that takes us back to New York. We're within an hour in New York. We got really great schools. We got a lot of green space. And so when they started itemizing kind of the bill for that, they got to the bottom and said, yeah, it's expensive. It's not expensive. When you get all that, right, it's expensive. So the same way, in fact, the phrase that they kept using was the sticker price, right? Well, the sticker price, the sticker price, when you look at it, is a little bit tough, but I mean, look at all the stuff you get. And so what I will say to you all is, if you don't reframe this conversation away from housing as a commodity, right, you're going to get stuck there, because every time people think about housing and how much it costs and that the costs are rising, they rationalize that through, right, that kind of itemized list. The same way you itemize when you get to the grocery line, you itemize all the stuff you bought. You get to the bill of fare and you go, yeah, well, I did buy some steaks in there. I got some, got some fresh food in there, whatever that is. And so the recommendation is we have to become adept at sort of having people talk about the both and. Hey, listen, folks, we can be a great place to live. We can be close to New York. We can have great transit, great schools, and we can also provide great housing options for people at all levels of income. We can actually walk and chew gum. We can have the both and then follow that up with examples, right, of either places or times or when that is actually true, right? So look at what's happened in this community or whatever that is, or look at what's happened even in other parts of the state or other parts of the country where folks have been able to handle both. They got a great transit system in this, and they're able to offer great opportunities for folks at multiple levels of development. So this is really important, because this is the way that people are rationalizing themselves out of this conversation. If you want to keep them embedded in it, you got to give them a way to think about the both and, otherwise you're going to lose people's ability to stay connected to this issue. Number 4 was position housing as a shaping force. I won't say much about this one. This is one that's more in depth, but I will just say that when people started to think about what it costs for housing, they started to think about how you fix it. Most folks don't know much about how the housing system and how their neighborhoods are actually shaped in development, or they're shaped and developed. So they don't know what to fix in housing, right? They don't know much about housing policy. What they do know about is they know about how much they earn. They know a lot about education. So what tends to happen is people gravitate to the systems they know a little bit about. And they say consistently, well, if you really want to afford housing, you got to have a better education and get you a better job that pays you more money. And so that should be the thing we work on. Like, let's get, maybe living wages or getting people paychecks higher. Let's get more education. And when we do that, housing will resolve itself. And what I will say to you all on this call is you got to help people reverse the order of that. Position housing as the shaping force by saying, hey, listen, folks, when you have housing, it allows you to get the additional education that you need to, right? It allows you to help your kids in school, right? It allows you to keep the job right? So housing is the thing that's driving the other stuff, not the other way around. And you want to position housing in that way. You want to flip that order, because if you don't, people get stuck in fixing the other stuff and they don't get around to the harder stuff, which is the housing system that they really don't understand very well. So we have some examples in the final playbook that gives a way to kind of reposition that in the conversation. And it's not a hard thing to do. It's just being thoughtful about how you're narrating that across the spectrum. Okay, I'm going to speed it up here because I know I'm a talker, and so I can spend the next 2 hours talking, and I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. So I'm going to speed it up a little bit with the caveat that at the end we're going to talk about another opportunity for those of you who want more of this. We want me to slow down and kind of walk through more of the examples and talk. We're happy to do that, not only in the Q&A, but also another session that we're going to do for those of you who really want to lean in and really understand the recommendations at a much deeper level. So I'm going to speed it up with the recognition that we're going to do another session for folks who want that. So shift folks out of sympathy mode. When people think, especially when you ask them to think about affordable housing, because they don't think it's for them or that they will ever benefit. It's not, and this is really important. It's not just that they have negative kind of visions of what affordable housing is, but it's also it's not that they don't think that they qualify, right? Because sometimes we get stuck in thinking, well, maybe they don't think they qualify. Maybe if we show them like the police officer, the teacher, the yada, 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 who would qualify, so they see themselves in the group of folks who could get affordable housing. It's not that, it's that they don't think that they will ever actually benefit, right? That there may be a couple people who get access to it, but I'll never get that. I'm never going to be able to benefit from that. And so a part of this is because of that, they think it's other people. It becomes charity. If we do something in the space, it's for those people out there, not something for me. And what I will say to you is you have to shift people out of that sense of this is charity for those folks so they can get better. No, this is about an investment in our future and an investment in Fairfield, right? This is something that actually has benefits to all of us. And we are patient, thoughtful impact investors, right? We invest in the impact we want to have in our communities. That pays dividends over the long term, and that's why this is an investment, not charity that we're handing out to folks, which is the way people think about it if you don't reframe the conversation. So 6 was about amplifying values. So values can do the heavy lifting. When you speak to people's values outside of not just policy, but their values, they're more likely to lean in a little bit on some of these issues. And so the recommendation here, we will probably spend in the longer session that we do a lot more time on this issue, number 6, on values. Because some of these values are really important. They're shared, right? People have a sense of them, and you could hear them when they talked about, when they talked about why this issue was important, you heard those values coming out. And I would say there were at least 3 strong values that tended to animate the conversation. So we want to put those in front of folks and amplify them, make them bigger, stronger, as much as we can in everything, in our stories, in our art, in our spoken word, in all the places where our narratives and stories are being told. One was this conversation about diversity. People had a value for the idea that Fairfield County was diverse and it was important to them. Now, listen, I know we're going to have a lot of conversation about this because there was some there was some interesting conversation about this issue of diversity, about whether Fairfield is diverse. And it's funny because I'm not from Connecticut, so I don't tend to think of Connecticut as a whole, or in Fairfield in particular, as particularly diverse. But what's more important, in my opinion, is that the residents of Fairfield think that Fairfield is diverse and they value it, right? The level at which they were talking about and struggling with the idea that, man, if we don't fix affordable housing, then we kind of lose the diversity. And they were struggling with that. Like, what does it mean that we value this thing, but we don't have policies that it, right? And so what I would say to you is there's an opportunity there to push on that a little bit about what it means to really value diversity, not just as a theoretical proposition, but in action. So diversity and what it means to this Fairfield County is important as a value. A second value that came up consistently was this issue of health and well-being and housing and how those things were connected. And the interesting part about this is it didn't come up in a sort of positive context, like housing helps you, protect you against, all kinds of, things that could be negative or helps you preserve your health. It really came up in a negative context. Most folks were talking about how hard they were working just to be able to afford Fairfield, working 2 jobs, or, I'm a business owner and man, I never get to see my family. And they talked a lot about the mental health and the stress of working so hard to be able to afford to stay. And this was across the income spectrum. This was not just the low income folks saying, I'm working 2 jobs and I'm stressed out. This was some of the high income folks saying, man, I'm tapped out. And they talked about it in terms of the impact on their personal relationship. My children, I'm concerned about and I don't have time to do this with my kids. I'm concerned about, they talk about their marriages and a whole series of personal relationships that they were trading off to be able to afford to stay here. That kind of mental health conversation is a winner for us. Like, that's exactly right. People should not have to trade off their marriages, their kids' future, their relationships, right? Just so that they have a decent place to live. And that's not only for low-income folks, but for everybody in Fairfield. Like, we ought to have an approach to what it means to our housing system that allows folks to do the both and, to have a great life, to enjoy all the green space we have, to enjoy the amenities of Fairfield, and be able to afford their homes without having to be in such a stressful circumstances. But people talked about that at a level of depth, like what they felt like it was doing to their kids. They talked about especially kids in low-income communities who really are have to work at early ages and don't have the ability to develop their talent and potential. And so that's an opportunity to really open up that can and help people really passionately connect to this issue of housing, because housing and lowering the cost of that helps us to address that. The third value that came up consistently was around this issue of children's opportunity, that they talked about the impacts of being so stressed out on kids, about having kids not be able to show up in socially expected ways and not being able to monitor their kids and build relationships with kids and all that right stuff, and concerned about kids' opportunity in Fairfield and what kind of life they would have, and could they afford to come back and stay, could their kids come back after college or whatever and afford this place. They're saddled with so much debt. We're saddling them with long-term hardship. Is that the legacy we want to leave? I mean, they had these deep conversations about that. So what I would say to you is that's a value system that people are struggling with, and it allows us a window into this conversation. So just to be clear, those 3 values: diversity, animating concern, huge conversation around health and well-being, but especially around the stress of what it means to be in a place that costs a lot to live and having to work so much. And the third one was children's opportunity, big animating concerns. So number 7 was talking about what people lose when they don't lean in. So people could tell you a long list of things they felt like they were going to lose if more affordable housing was placed in their community. They were concerned about their property values, and they were concerned about some people that deserve to and they talked about more density. I moved to Fairfield and I want that. I want to have my parking space and all the things they felt like they would lose if they would be starting to invest in more density in the region, and et cetera, et cetera. And the only thing I would say here is you also have to make sure that you're reminding people what they stand to lose if they're not working with us to solve this problem, right? So it's telling people, listen, every day that we're not getting in front of this issue and working to solve it, right, we are jeopardizing the Fairfield that we said that we love. Every day that we're not taking the opportunity to step back and think about how we make room for all the folks that we need in this community, right, we're going to lose the ability actually to shape that future. So being very clear about that. You love this community. We know you do. You said it. The value system you shaped around, having a diverse place, having opportunity for our children, making sure that people feel that health and well-being that's connected to housing. We know that we want that, but we're going to lose our ability to shape that if we don't lean into this conversation, right? So tell folks what they lose, right, by not working with you, because that's important in terms of shaping their sense of, whether or not they need to lean in on this issue. Okay. 8 was about is lots of conversation in the playbook just about this issue of centering equity as an animating concern. Center equity in the conversation. It's not just that we need housing, we do need housing, but we need to make sure that we're also being thoughtful about the policies that make sure that all folks across, at all income levels, actually have the housing that they need. And I would just say, you don't assume that because people are talking about diversity, because they are, and don't assume that because they can have a decent conversation about the growing economic and racial divide, which they can, they were very good at that. Don't assume that that also leads them to support equitable policies. The way to position that in the conversation is to use equity as a metric of success. So when you talk to people and you say, how do we know that we're making progress and that our housing system is moving in the right direction? When we start to see equity being reflected in the outcomes that our housing system is producing for all kinds of groups. And you all can name the groups that are most important to you in terms of equity. Certainly racial equity is a part of it, but start talking about that as a measure of success and accountability. So equity gets produced as this positive thing, not as this negative thing when we are a growing inequality, or the negative thing, the way that equity usually shows up in our conversation, which is as a negative. We want to shift that to a positive. When we know, we can see that we're producing equitable housing outcomes for a wider range of folks in our region, that's how we'll know that our housing system is actually working and we're moving in the right direction. Okay. 9, I would just say, I won't say much about this, but just making sure that we're speaking to a housing-focused message may only appeal to housing-focused folks. So sometimes that messaging we can pull from other folks. So folks in the healthcare space, folks who are talking about racial justice and the racial wealth gap. I mean, all of that is directly related to their ability to have a decent, to their housing circumstances. And so our ability to connect to those narratives is really important. And in the playbook, we give some examples of how we can make those connections. 10 was mobilizing people's own sense of agency. So this is important in the sense of our goal is to tell a bigger, wider story of us, right? That we all have a role to play. And I say this, not only in the book that I share with folks, but in the playbook as well. People often assigned affordable housing to, quote unquote, the government. And then when they assigned it to government, they got mad because government wasn't able to solve it. For those of us who are in affordable housing, what we know is affordable housing takes a wide range of stakeholders to pull this thing together. There's a whole lot of folks, a whole lot of stakeholders that's got to be aligned and rocking in the same direction for us to build affordable housing, for us to produce more housing, for us to make the capital available for that to be necessary. I mean, there's a whole lot of folks in this process, but for most of the public, they only see government, they assign it, and when it's not working well, they say, well, see, it's just an example of government not working well. We have to start to build out a bigger story so that people see their own stake in it and they see themselves in it. Every single person you talk to should have an affordable housing story, whether or not they've owned their homes in Fairfield for the last 40 or 50 years, or the family, doesn't matter. You have an affordable housing too. And our opportunity is to help people connect to that. I'm happy to give some examples in the Q&A if people want to talk about that, but that bigger story of us is really important. Otherwise, people assign it to government and then displace it and complain, but they don't feel like they are being called into this conversation directly. 11 was just about our organizations, making sure we take the time to remind people that there are lots of folks who work on affordable housing in Fairfield, have been working on this for a long time. There are solutions that work, but they need more scale. And this is important to battle people's sense of cynicism, right? That anything can really happen. Oh, nothing's gonna happen. Well, actually a lot is happening, but it needs more scale. And that's why we need, right, you to lean in and help us grow that. I won't say much more about that, but I hope you see that your organization, the way that you talk about your work and the linkage up to this is really critical and important. So 12 is navigating those dominant narratives. So don't assume that because more people are finding themselves in a position where they probably need affordable housing, honestly, with what's happening economically. Don't assume because of that that the stigma around affordable housing or who it's for has abated in any way. I mean, we heard a lot of folks, well, affordable housing, people say, I worked hard all my life to get out of a situation where I need affordable housing. I don't want to be in that stuff. And they talked about there being a negative connotation. They talked a lot about the racial and ethnic, the ways that people characterize it as those people and who they see as is benefiting, right, those people or other people. Even some of the people of color, I would say, in the room, you know, had some pretty interesting things to say, let's just call it that, about the people who live in affordable housing. And so even though I think in the affordable housing industry, we've done a lot to try and grow outside of the negative constructions of what people think about affordable housing. Sometimes I know a lot of us do tours so that when we build something really beautiful in communities, we ask people to come and look, because it doesn't look like, you know, most of the time what is affordable housing is it actually looks better than the surrounding community, because we have to, otherwise, like we're not allowed to build it. We can't get folks to buy into it. But that's not the public conception. And so we have to develop some ways of telling that story that navigate around some of that stigma around that. And in the playbook, we give some examples of how you just navigate around it, tell a bigger story that people want to see themselves in. And I think that is really important, because there's such a negative conception of what affordable housing is. People don't want to be in that story. I mean, think about that. Like, I don't want to be associated with it. Well, what I think is the public conception, is that affordable housing is often lumped into public housing and Section 8 and people who are, you know, not deserving, and folks who are not making it, people who are, right? And so they don't really want to be in that story. We got to tell bigger stories that make people want to feel like they're deeply connected to and have a stake in that story, because right now they don't want to be in it. So there are a lot of ways you can do that, right? But even in terms of what we talk about, those value systems, like when you saw the range of folks talking about the stress of what it means to be living in this moment and trying to afford housing, that was a bigger story. Like, hey, listen, we're all in a community where we're struggling, right? But, you know, we are resilient folks in Fairfield. Let's talk about the ways in which we've been resilient in the past and how we can bring that energy to this conversation, because all of us, right, need support. We want to make sure that we're centering folks who are struggling the hardest. That's why we're focusing on people at this level of income. But at the end of the day, this is really about us, right, as in Fairfield, helping each other, making sure that that there's space. We're making room for everybody, right, who works here, lives here, contributes here, loves here, right, wants to stay here. That's a bigger story than we're going to build affordable housing for these folks. So we have to get used to telling those kind of bigger stories. And the last one I would say,
of inequality in terms of housing, I don't think of it necessarily, and you mentioned middle income, and we are in a house in Fairfield County.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But both my husband and I work 2 jobs.
Sorry.
To have that, so we wouldn't be considered high.
Sorry, hold on. Sorry about that. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. I had actual video to share with y'all, and those videos were starting to play. I was like, "Who is that on the call?" It's not that. It was videos that were all queued up to share. And as I said, in the longer sessions, when we go through this, we're going to actually have you listen to folks who were in these community voice sessions, so you can hear their voices, and so you'll recognize why we're making some of the recommendations that are here. Anyway, so the last one. Call to action. So this was really about the way that how we're calling people to action. A lot of what happens in affordable housing is trying to call people to action through negatively framed data. So we'll say the numbers of people who are about to be evicted, and the numbers of people who are housing cost burden at 30% of AMI, or the number of people at 50% of their income in affordable housing, or the numbers of people who do this, and all of that is negatively framed data, and we do that to try and drive urgency. What we know from a good deal of social science and from talking to folks in these community voice sessions is it actually has the opposite effect. It makes people feel like this thing is so big, there's nothing they can do, and its price is written, and they don't want to be in that story. They don't want it, right? Nobody wants to be in a story that's about folks failing and what's happening, and right? So the counter to that is your call to action should be about what's working. Listen, let me tell you about this thing we're doing, and it's working. Folks are able to get housing, but hey, it needs more support and it needs more scale. That's why we're asking you to lead in with us. Help us figure out how to make sure that more of us, have the opportunity to live in Fairfield and enjoy Fairfield without having to sacrifice our families the way that lots of folks are doing, without having to sacrifice our children, without having to all the things, right? Help us to do that. It's working, it just needs more scale, right? And I realize that that is a nuanced conversation, but most of all, what I want folks to get is that negatively framed data is not the thing that pulls people forward. It actually pushes them away. So use our data to highlight what can happen. Wow, when we invest in affordable housing, this many folks are going to be able to get, affordable housing. This many folks are going to be able to send their kids to school. This many folks are going to get home just a little bit earlier from work or whatever it is and be able to work. This many families are going to be able to, whatever that is, and talk about that, the vision of what this will do for folks that we want as the call to action versus the negative stuff. And I know that's hard because those of us who are working in the field, we're looking at a tsunami that's coming in terms of just the needs of the community and what, especially after COVID-19, like this is serious. We're looking at the tsunami and we want to describe that. Oh my God, do y'all see what's happening? But when you do that, just remember that it has the opposite effect. It pushes folks away. It makes it feel like it's too big to solve and they don't want to be in that story, right? Folks are struggling and they don't want to feel like not only do they have to figure out their own circumstances, but now they got to work with you to figure out the circumstances of quote unquote other people. And that's not a winning call to action. So I'm going to stop there and say, in the actual playbook, we give some good examples of how you can use language for these things. So I'm hoping that folks, we share that will work with us and look at that. But I want to stop because I know I'm way over and I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion. So I'm going to stop there, stop sharing my screen and open up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. T. I think I can speak for everyone on this webinar. I'm fortunate enough that this is the second opportunity I've had to somewhat digest this information, and I learned something new each time. So I think you've given us a really robust set of regional information for us to grapple with here. So we have a bunch of questions. I have some thoughts that I've pulled together based on some commentary that's been in the chat, so I want to jump right in. But I want to remind people we do have about another half hour, a little more, to be together this morning. So if you have additional questions, keep them coming. And just one point of clarification, for those paying attention to the chat, we already made it, but in case you weren't, when Dr. T is referring to Fairfield in her presentation, she's meaning Fairfield County. So just a little nuance, because those of us that live here know Fairfield is its own city in the county. We are always referring to the county in the aggregate. So the first thing I'd like to dig into a little more, Dr. T, is this question about attachment to Fairfield County. So, you and I actually had a conversation about this when we first talked about the data findings, and that's come up in terms of the webinar as well, that people are like, wait a minute, no, that's not true. People don't have an attachment to Fairfield County. Connecticut's the most parochial state ever. We've got home rule. No one has a sense of identity in the county. That's our big problem. So can you help draw that connection for us in terms of what you actually heard and what people were saying and what many of us who live and work in Fairfield County might perceive to be how people interpret their lived experience?
Yeah, actually, so thanks so much for that, Mendi. And actually, I want to say what people are experiencing on the call may actually be correct. So the actual questions that we asked folks was, some of these sessions, like I'll say, tell me what you love about Fairfield. Like I said, and usually I use the sort of insider outsider kind of, positioning to have people as experts, position people there as experts to tell me as the outsider, the uninformed outsider, what's happening there. And so I say, listen, Fairfield is expensive, man. Y'all are living in a place that's so expensive. I live in a whole nother state. I live in Orlando, Florida. I'm like, come on down. What are y'all doing there? What are you living there for? Like, all these places where you can go and have sunshine and blah, blah, blah. So I'm trying to figure out, what are y'all living there for? Like, come on, like, right? And I use that to draw out of people the things that they feel like Fairfield represents. And I will say to you that they weren't saying, Fairfield's okay. I mean, they were saying, wow, what I really love about this place, I love about Fairfield is this, I love that, we are a place that's really diverse. I love that people try to help each other here. I love that the schools are great. And so they were going through this list of, and I say that because I do this work in other places, and in some places there's not that kind of passionate expression of attachment. When I'm doing this work in DC, nobody in DC says they love DC. They say, oh, I'm here for a job. I came here and I don't know. I mean, it's all right. I mean, I live here, but I mean, there's no sense of attachment at all. Like, they don't have that. You all have that. Now, I will say it may be that when people were responding to that, they may have been responding from the vantage point of like their own neighborhoods and communities. So you all may know more about that than me. But the general question was, I was trying to figure out whether when you ask people about that, you know, is there a sense of like, I'm here because I see the benefit of being here and I can list what those are, versus I don't really care about this place one way or another. I'm just trying to go to, right? And you have that. So leverage it. Like you have that. People can name it. And not only did they name it, but when you ask them, could they remember when y'all have done some great things together, they were going on. I mean, that was a long list of things. I'm like, well, all right, well, okay. And I couldn't verify whether those things were true or not, because I don't know, but they were at least able to list a series of things that they felt like was there, that they were proud of. So I would say leverage that. You have that. But I think it is true for many of you on the call. They may have been thinking about that in terms of their neighborhoods, right? Even though I was asking a question about Fairfield. So yeah. Mendi, you're on mute.
Thank you. So just to, I guess, dig into this question about regional versus town-based thinking a little more. I think there is a sense, and obviously none of us who were in the focus group, so we can't say explicitly, but there's a sense from people who have been doing this work in Fairfield County around housing, that there is this sense of when people identify community here, they're referring to their town and their really sort of local community and not necessarily the region. So based on your work across the country, have you seen narratives that are effective in shifting that thinking from very sort of localized to more regional, broader based thinking in communities?
Yeah, and sometimes if there's, so generally speaking, most people don't come to the table thinking region. So for those folks in the chat who are saying, yeah, we've been trying to get people out of the mindset of this is my little small community, can you think regionally? I would say that you got to get people into that mindset. And there's language that helps people to talk about that. You can say ultimately, things like ultimately what happens in one community deeply affects the folks next door. We're not kind of operating as if we're in islands. All of us, right, operating under sort of whole parts of the region, are operating as a region, whether or not we're functioning like that or not. And you can say that, listen, we are undermining our regional economy, right, by leaving whole parts of the region, right, without the diverse mix of housing that they need. That affects all of us. And then tell them how, from a regional standpoint, because we're not having a sense of broader regionalism, that it's affecting us. But the thing about it is, what's shaping that kind of, I'm just concerned about what's in my town versus those other towns, is they don't see the interconnectedness of towns across the region. So you might have to get some of that in that conversation. Otherwise, it falls to the floor. But I would also say is you can get people to think about that, right? They can think about that the sum of the parts, right, versus just the parts themselves, by giving them robust examples of how that kind of segmented thinking, that kind of separate fates, actually hurts all of us across the region. But I would say be explicit about that in the work. So yeah, totally, that makes total sense to me.
Yeah, thank you for that. So one of the other, I think, fascinating things that came out of this research was this question around shared values, and in particular, diversity as one of the shared values in the county. And you had a little bit of interesting dialogue around sort of like, what do people who don't live here think? And it's not necessarily that people think of Connecticut or Fairfield County as the most diverse places when they're outside of this region. But we do know that within the state and within the county, particularly in our cities and our urban centers, there's quite a bit of diversity. But the question of how people really interpret that diversity, I think, is one that is on the minds of a lot of folks. I saw lots of commentary on that in the chat. So I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit more color on what you gleaned from the conversations in terms of what did people really mean by this shared value of diversity? And someone actually went as far as saying, oh, maybe that was all just rhetorical.
Mm-hmm. So I would say that, and I think we say that in the slides, that I think so. There are two things that we often have a value set that we lean into as values, but they're all kind of things that are barriers to us leaning into those values. So what I often try to listen for is what are the reasons why people say that this is important, or what people say they value. So I think what the good news is, I think in Fairfield, however they define it, and there was quite a bit of difference or disparities across different kinds of groups. However they define it, this idea of diversity was a centering conversation, right? I think some of the folks on the higher end of the spectrum, they're even talking about diversity in terms of the diversity in terms of the kinds of shops and small business owners, and they see that as leaving the region. Like, listen, we're losing the businesses, and these small, like, we can't function in this environment. So their notion of diversity was different. They weren't talking about racial diversity. They had a whole different conception. I think if you talk to the people of color in the group, they were talking about racial and ethnic diversity and the need to have it. But other folks were having, so all that to say is that lots of folks had different conceptions of diversity. We weren't trying to standardize that. But when you put that value system out there, right, people leaned into that conversation. What I would offer to you all is there are lots of different ways to animate that conversation and make that really resonant with different groups across Fairfield. But the idea of it is important as a strong value that people leaned into. The separate question that I think is an important one is, does leaning into the value of diversity necessarily mean that you lean into policies that are about centering equity, right? Do I lean into what it actually takes to maintain a Fairfield that is diverse? And what I would say is, don't make that assumption, right? That was it. Don't make the conversation about diversity doesn't necessarily translate one-to-one into the actual work. You got to help people make the jump between those things. What I can say is that folks in Fairfield are struggling with that because they want to see themselves as like a county that values diversity, and we have that, and they're struggling with what's happening in affordable housing and that we don't have that, and the lack of affordable housing is taking that away. So you've got an opportunity to have a wedge there, right? You've got an opportunity to sort of say, hey, listen, folks, we're not living up to the values we express. Like, this is a way to help us live into that, right? So anyway, I know there's a lot of conversation about that, but that diversity, I was actually shocked because I wasn't expecting that conversation to be as robust as it was, but a lot of, they kept coming back to that, even more so than the other two, value systems. So I would say you've got some shared values. It may be, people think about them differently, but you've got at least that kind of shared space where people at least are leaning into that as an animating concern.
So a little more on that. I think you're right. We do tend to hear a lot about, people, at least in theory, wanting to live in diverse communities. One counter narrative that often tends to come up, though, is, well, I would like my community to be diverse, but, to your point, I worked really hard to get here, and I have to think about and protect my own property value, and that's just going to really hurt my property value. Now, again, those of us that work in the space know that data doesn't really bear that out, that diversifying housing stock really lowers housing value, but it's a narrative, and it's a very strong narrative. So what thoughts can you give us in terms of, helping to bridge that divide between, like, as you said, we have this value, but we've got this really big glaring problem that may or may not be data informed, but it's a strong narrative.
Yeah, great question. So I would say two things there. Number one, right, when you sort of put out the value of diversity, I would say put it out in a very kind of general way and let them tell you what they mean by that. So when they say, listen, I'm concerned that, man, all the mom and pop stores that used to be able to be here are leaving, like they can't survive in this environment. I'm concerned that the diversity of employers we used to have in this region are gone. I'm concerned that that's their notion of diversity. You would say absolutely. And one of the things that's driving that we're losing that kind of diversity is the lack of affordable housing, and let us tell you how. In fact, one of the examples that we have in the playbook is specifically around teachers. It's getting harder and harder to recruit competent, thoughtful, really long-term, veteran teachers, folks who've been in the community for who want to be here, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you care about that and the diversity of the quality of teaching and the teachers that we're able to attract here, the number one thing you can do about that is housing, because they can't afford to live here. If you want to attract great teachers, you need to have great housing. That's kind of what it comes down to. So the thing about it is to listen to how they articulate their version of diversity And when you do that, then follow up with you. Well, let me tell you how housing affects that, right? So that's one part of that conversation. The second part of it is what they're articulating to you is the loss conversation, what I call loss aversion, right? Loss aversion is the single most dominating force in all of human decision making. You can tell people what they're getting, but the way to think about this in a very colloquial way is a bird in hand is worth two in the bush. Right? You can tell people, listen, if we build more affordable housing, we get to have this and this and this and this great. People think, yeah, but if I let go of this bird in my hand, I'm not sure I'll actually get that, right? You may be promising me stuff that you really can't deliver on. Policymakers promise me all the time, but they don't really deliver. So I'm keeping my hand in the bush, and so that's what that loss aversion is. So our opportunity is to get lost back on the other side of the table. Like, yeah, I'm not going to debate about property values, but what I can tell you is this. If we don't get in front of this issue of the lack of affordable housing in this region, you're going to not only lose property values, you might even lose the very community that you say you love. And let me tell you how, right? So now the loss is not about, right? Listen, you want to be more, that's not about property values. What you ought to be concerned about is these larger circumstances that are happening that you're not paying attention to. So now I got to figure, wait, now this bird in the hand doesn't seem so great because I'm about to lose that thing, right? Because I'm not leaning into what it means to create an environment for everybody. So two strategies there. One, give people the space to define diversity and tell them how that relates to housing. And then second, put loss back on the other side of the table. Tell them what they lose when they don't lean into the issues that we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. So you referenced policymakers in your last answer, and a question has come up sort of related to the role of kind of whose responsibility is all of this, right? So is it policymakers? Is it government? Is it private sector? Is it individual agency? As we kind of talked about early in your presentation, that sense that people can do this on their own. Did that theme come up at all in terms of what the narrative is around whose problem people believe this is?
Yeah.
And who's responsible for the solution?
Yep. So that's an important one. So when we talk to most folks, as I said in the presentation, most folks really don't know how communities actually get developed. They don't know all the range of players, right, that are involved in the process. So they don't know like what to fix. They don't know kind of how to grab the thing and fix it. So that was a part of the conversation. They were avoiding having the housing conversation, and they kept gravitating back to health and they gravitating back to education. Because those are things they understand. They understand teachers in the classroom, the principals, like they can name the players. And then you got the school board and you got the same thing in health. They can name the doctor in the hospital. In housing, they can't name that many people, right? So they don't know what to fix, right? So a part of over time, I think one of the larger issues is we have to make people we have to educate people a little bit about what it takes to do the work that we do so that they understand the context in which we're working. But it's also that because they can't name the range of players, they just put a big government stamp on housing. Like, it's government, folks. It's government's problem. I don't know who else is, but government, right? And then when they do that, when government can't solve it, it falls into this very comfortable narrative that people are very interested in having, which is government can't solve it. Government is bad. Government is, we've been fighting that narrative since Reagan, but that's a whole nother story. But government can't solve it, government is bad, government is the problem. And then they go down this rabbit hole of talking about government and its failure. And that is totally counterproductive. Government may or may not be challenged by these issues. It may or may not be making things worse or better, but it doesn't help us to have the conversation fall into that ditch. So the counter to that is to say, no. We actually determine what government. We, to empower people, to say, no. We actually empower. It may take us a while, our voices may take some time to be heard, but when we get together and mobilize on these issues, we are the ones who can shape what happens. We just have to have the courage to stand up and be consistent in how we're voicing kind of what we need and want for our communities. And when you engage folks like that and you put it back in their place and you can give them the sense of being the decision maker, or as I call it, the investor, we're impact investors. We're investing in the impact that we want. When you put people in that kind of decision-making position, you reposition people in the conversation, and now you give them the opportunity and license to act. And that's really important, because right now, right? They're able to step back and displace that conversation. It's for other people to solve. It's not my problem. Either I'm not directly affected by affordable housing, or I don't have any way to be the agent of change in that. Not my problem. We're making people directly know this is your problem. It deeply affects you. It deeply affects your future. And you are the ones who decide what government, quote unquote, does, and all the range of other players that are around that activity. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but that government kind of conversation is derailing a lot of our efforts to move this issue forward. And if we don't get very thoughtful and strategic about how we advance it, man, it just falls in a rabbit hole that is hard to pull people back out of.
Yeah. So you have framed this, which I think is really excellent, in terms of constantly thinking about a way to approach these conversations in a way that expands opportunity and isn't deficit based. So in the first two sessions in this webinar series, we talked a lot about sort of how did we get here, right? And so part of the reality of how we got here is that there has been a very, very long history, essentially since the beginning of this great American experiment, related to housing that has been really fundamentally grounded in racial discrimination, right? So that's a truth. But when we're talking about narrative, the question of how to engage around that topic, I think, gets a little hairier and a little more complicated. So one of the questions that's come from some folks in the audience is that we're in this moment, right? And so you said, let's take advantage of this moment. We're all turning on the TV. We're seeing crises. It's horrible, but crises can motivate, right? And so part of that motivation has been a lot of white people in particular being open to reading books and learning and engaging sort of in that sort of historical grounding. So how do we think about that moment, that opportunity, and also kind of balance it against what you were saying about, well, let's not start people at a place that's just not going to resonate, in terms of the connection of race and racism in the messaging. Like, how do we balance all of that?
Yeah.
That's not an easy question.
Yeah. So this is a big one. I have a whole. you just, Mendi, you just stepped in it, girl.
I figured as much, but
I got a whole shebang bang boogie on this one. But so my initial comment is to say, just in terms of acknowledging and naming the moment is part of grabbing the moment that we're in, where people are having these conversations about racial justice and equity and what that's looking like, and they're more open than they have been in some time. What I would say is grab this moment to have those conversations. That this is a moment where even in the context of housing, you can start talking about what it means. Like what it means to be investing in housing, and the investment in housing is directly related to, right, the ability to show up and produce more equitable outcomes across the region. And so what I would say is share that. So for example, you can't get to racial justice and racial equity without going through the door of housing. You can't get there. You can't get there in part for what everybody probably on this call knows, because housing is for most families, the number one expense they have at the end of the month. Right? Number one thing they got to pay for, and the number one hurdle they got to get up and over if they're renters. Even if they're homeowners, home ownership is the number one way that people, that's the number one asset they have. For most folks, it's the only asset they have when they have a home. So you can't get to things like solving the racial wealth gap if you're not addressing housing. It doesn't happen. So there's a natural connection between folks who are trying to talk about racial justice and what has happened that to get us here in this moment, and how we get to a better place. Housing is a part of the solution to get there. What I would say to you all in this moment is, on this issue, I think we have to acknowledge what's happened in the past. That centering equity in this conversation is really important. For those of you who are trying to get people of color into this conversation, they're not coming unless there is an acknowledgement of how we got here in the first place. Like, acknowledge the harm that's been caused in the past. We've had decades, right, of redlining in our community. We've had decades where folks were denied opportunities of not just home ownership, but renting. We've had decades of, and you can talk about displacement from jobs and communities. That has all, right, landed in our laps. But now is the moment to change that. Housing can be part of that. And our efforts to expand and diversify the mix of homes across this region is explicitly about advancing racial equity, but also inclusion in our region. So it's not that you can't have that strong conversation about the history. I would say have it. as long as you queue up housing as part of the solution and solve for some of that. So if you're putting both those things together, that works. What tends to happen though is some of us are just, and I'm gonna just say it, we're just mad. Like this is a moment, you're just mad. Like you want people to just, you just want to give them the whole history because we haven't had folks really acknowledge what has happened. People don't show up, they act like, like the playing field has been leveled and why can't y'all figure it out? Like, are you serious? Like that kind of like, having that moment being incredulous. And so what I would say is that those folks who've been waiting for the opportunity to have those conversations, this is the moment. And I'd also say we have more evidence and data and information than ever before to help people. I mean, I work a lot with my colleague, Richard Rothstein. Some of you read his book. Obviously, it's been important for shaping conversations about desegregation. But I would say now, what used to be conspiracy theory, which was we knew that lots of folks are being left behind intentionally, is now in black and white, where there's evidence behind it. Like, this is not conspiracy theory anymore. We're showing you in black and white print what was written, how it was manufactured and designed to produce the outcomes that we have. And there has to be an acknowledgement of that for us to move forward. So I can talk about that, but you're not going to get people of color to lean in hard on this issue unless there is that acknowledgement and then queuing up housing as a potential solution for some of what has gone wrong in economic and social.
Yeah. Let me ask a little bit of a follow-up question to that then. So in light of the fact that everyone is starting in a very different place. So as you just referenced, there are some folks who have been saying, wow, I'm in a moment now where I can actually have this conversation I've been waiting for. There are some folks who are saying, I'm really not comfortable having this conversation at all. There are some folks who are saying, I didn't know this was a conversation I needed to be having, but I'm open to it. So you got to see the diversity of the county in the focus groups. What do you think there is in fact a common narrative that can kind of link all of these groups and that we should be using, or to what degree do we need to be kind of nuancing the message based on where people are? And if we do need to nuance a lot, this is another complicated question, but how do we get to a place where everyone starts moving in the same direction if we're all kind of having slightly different messaging and slightly different starts?
Yeah. So I think, Mendi, you are right on target. So the issue is not that we need to have different conversations. We're going to have the same, because the conversation is the same. Listen, historically, right, we have had a series of, a system built on exclusionary policies to separate and divide folks, not to bring us together and give us all kind of the opportunity to live, right, in the places that, in Fairfield and other parts of the country. That conversation is a conversation of what it is. What has to be different is the lead up to that conversation. And I think what I'm hoping is that you all, as folks who've been in the field and housing for a very long time on this call, you all know that for some audiences, that's a longer walk. You need a longer runway, right, before you can get them to have this conversation that we're after. And for some folks, they're ready to have it right away. There's no long runway. Right? So the decision that you all need to make strategically when you're talking to different audiences or engaging different kinds of folks is, do I need a long runway to get there? Right, which is getting them ready for that, or can I really get to the point? And when I think of the long, for those folks who are not used to having this conversation and they're not even open to equity, they see the racial justice stuff on TV, but they're not willing to have this conversation. There's a longer runway, and a part of that can start with this conversation about diversity. So let them start to talk about diversity and what that means. They think it means, all we need, businesses. Okay, well, let's start there. And then ask the question, what other kinds of diversity do you think is really good for Fairfield, right? And let them begin to have the conversation. What? Oh, really? And actually people will start to talk about, but yeah, we need other kind of diversity. So really, what other kind of diversity do we need? And when they start talking, I've done this all over the country. It is amazing to me when you start to have that gendered conversation. You position people as experts, and then you ask them the question, ask them to be thoughtful, and they'll say, oh yeah, we need, people from different backgrounds, and we need, really, and how do you think we can get there? And they start saying stuff like, well, I guess we can do things that we can make, different kind of housing more affordable. Really? How do we do that? I mean, you got to kind of get people warmed up and softened up so they get, well, what do you think is keeping folks from, keeping that from happening? Well, I guess not everybody's had a real chance to do it. I mean, I think in this community, right? So there's a way in which you got to kind of soften people up to have a longer conversation. And I know, my sense is that I know it's hard when we're already battling so hard on just getting the affordable housing conversation off the ground. It's hard to also have to be strategic on that. But I feel like this is the moment, right, to be doing that when folks are struggling to have that conversation, right? That giving just a little push in that direction can help. Being patient enough to go through that longer runway to get them to the point, okay, now let's have this real conversation about what those policies have done, why they've been so harmful, and then what we need to do to turn around.
So last question, and I'd like to end on the note that I think you left us on, which is let's always talk about what's working. We have the benefit of having you and having the fact that you have worked in communities throughout the country on similar issues. So is there a community we should be looking towards, modeling after, where you've actually really kind of seen this narrative change work happen on the ground and be effective? Are there models you'd point us to?
Yeah, so I think there are lots of communities who have been able to do particular things. So some people have had really big success on zoning. Other folks have been able to have big success on bringing new capital and financial funds to the table. Some communities have been really helpful in positioning like things like community land trusts and 80. So it varies across different places because in each place there's a push for different kinds of policies. And I think, even in the Shelter Force magazine that I said before I'm a board member on, one of the things that we actively do is publish a lot of examples from across the country of winning battles on different kinds of spectrum. So even if you want to just pick up some of that kind of good, what's working from other places, but people can't imagine it yet in Fairfield, let me tell you what's happening in Camden or whatever, places where they've been able to overcome some of those initial reservations, like I shared before at the top, where people were saying, I don't want this in my community. Let me share with you what they did. Or a place like Denver, where they were trying to build some affordable housing. Big developer came in, decided they want to do something. The community pushed back. We don't want that, right? And they're like, wait a minute, this is what we thought you wanted. They stepped back and had a 2-year, active listening kind of conversation with the community about what the community actually wanted. And over time, they developed incredible, what has come out of that was not just the one development they thought they were going to produce out of that. What has happened is an entire community has sprung up around this issue. Not only are the relationships better, but also what the larger development that's come out of that has been made the community so much stronger. So there are these examples where people can come out of the other side with some really thoughtful examples for what's working. But I would probably venture to say, even across the state of Connecticut, there are pockets of places where things have worked well. Maybe there is a collaborative sharing across the state of some of those what's working. But the major point is what you said, Mendi, just reiterating that people need to hear you talk about what's working. So often from us, they hear what's wrong, what's all the negatively framed data. And so they don't think that the overwhelming sense is things are failing, not that things are successful but need more scale. So also let's end on that positive note that is the thing that we need to help people to connect with.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. T. I feel like I could do this with you just anytime. Yes. Anytime you want, just give me a call because this was so much fun. Hopefully everyone else really appreciated it as well and enjoyed the back and forth and really got the deep value from your presentation. We're very appreciative. And we're also really appreciative of Melville Charitable Trust for funding this particular work through the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. A couple just housekeeping notes. We will share a playbook with attendees. It'll be out sometime in mid-October, the official playbook. And we'll also offer, as Dr. T referenced, a follow-up session to do a deeper dive into how to integrate the playbook's narrative themes into your organization's communications. And I believe there's a Google Doc form available on your screen if you're interested in attending that longer, sort of more of a working group session. And I would just say in conclusion that now the partners of the Fairfield County Housing Alliance have a really powerful set of narrative tools, which can hopefully unify and amplify and elevate our collective voice on this really critical issue of affordable housing. And so I had the good fortune of being able to host the 3 parts of this series, and I'm very thankful to everyone for participating. And I think now our call to order for everyone is let's get to work. And then just last little piece of information as we think about getting to work, there is also a link to purchase Dr. T's book in the chat. So that can help us stay grounded as we get to work. So thank you everyone and have a great day.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you all for joining us for this this presentation by Tiffany Manuel. Thank you all for joining us for Tipping Point. You know, as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@pschousing.org, and we're going to be emailing you in a couple of days after the conference with a link to all of the recordings from the 30 different sessions that we put on this week. Those are going to be uploaded to YouTube throughout the week. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you all. And thank you so much for coming. We have in the chat just the survey I mentioned before for our Home Connecticut strategic planning. And finally, there's that follow-up session that Mendi Blue-Paca was discussing on the recording. And I have included a Google Doc with a link to register for that session on December 2nd. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great weekend. Bye.